Hello, my name is C.T. Scott, and we are here for a presentation of intersectionality and discrimination in the workplace. This is going to be held by our placement student, Paul Grinwis. It is a tool presentation per se with me, Chief Scott, the communications officer here at the Sudbury Worker Center, and then Paul. So he will take it away, introduce himself, and talk a little bit more about the importance of addressing harassment and violence in the workplace, and doing that with a lens that addresses the intersectionality in workers, between people, and between coworkers in the workplace, and how that's so important and crucial when we are trying to work in proactive and productive ways into an inclusive and barrier-free future. I'll let Paul take it away from here.
We're going to the next slide. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, TT. Appreciate the introduction. So my name is Paul, and like TT said, I am a placement student. And I was tasked with doing some presentations on discrimination in the workplace. And I got to do this one, which will focus a little bit more on intersectionality. And if you've never heard of that before, that's fine. I'll do a little bit of explaining a little further on in the presentation. So a little bit about me, excuse me. I am a student studying at Laurentian, and I am completing my final year of a Bachelor of Social Work program. And I currently work as a DSW, a developmental service worker for the company Christian Horizons. So I essentially work with people with developmental disabilities to help them make better choices and live their life more fruitfully and independently. So I'm doing this in partnership with SWEAC, the Sudbury Workers Education Advocacy Center, and their mission and mandate is listed there. SWEAC is an organization of workers, students, and community volunteers committed to improving the lives and working conditions of people in low wage and unstable employment. They deliver support and education on workers' rights, provide community spaces for workers to share and learn together, and ensure that all workers have a voice and are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. I've been with SWEAC for the past, I guess it's 4 months now, something like 4 months, and I have nothing bad. I have only good things to say about SWEAC, so I'm happy to do this presentation for them.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to quickly add on that, just very quickly onto that last point, that this is what we do. Our main basis is to make sure that we are putting on presentations, workshops, and interacting with the public as many ways that we can, so that we can give them information and give them the resources that are out there. So we're very grateful to have Paul here to provide this presentation for you and to just let you guys know a little bit more about intersectionality in the workplace. So I'll give it back to Paul and thank him again for that great introduction about SWEAC and who we are.
Okay, so kind of the first thing we need to get out of the way is the kind of legal frameworks that guide discrimination and harassment in the workplace. The first one is the Ontario Health and Safety Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation that gives a legal framework to keep you safe at work in very specific ways. So some of them are listed here. It sets regulations for safety at work for employers and employees. One of the big parts of the Ontario Health and Safety Act is the right to refuse unsafe work. If you think that you are engaging in work that is not safe, or you believe that there is a risk, you have the right to say no. And further, it also covers harassment and bullying policy, which we'll get into later. And it also gives active protection for toxic work environments. Now, one that is a little bit different and more specified than that is the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And this sets a legal framework so that all people are treated equally in Ontario, regardless of different specified grounds. For example, people cannot be denied a job or treated badly in the workplace because of their religion, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. Now, there are specified grounds upon which you cannot discriminate. In fact, there are 17 different grounds on which you cannot be discriminated against. These are the two legal frameworks that govern harassment, bullying, and discrimination, and they are a little bit different, and I've done an entire presentation on the difference between these two things. But for this presentation, this will be kind of a good enough overview to talk about discrimination in the workplace and intersectionality. And there's more information on this, on these two legal frameworks on the SWEAC website and resources that they have. So first, let's talk about some definitions that we all kind of are on the same page about what we're talking about. The first of which is bullying. So bullying is defined and involves repeated incidents or a pattern of behavior that is intended to intimidate, offend, degrade, or humiliate a particular person or group of people. It can cause either physical or emotional harm and can include tactics such as verbal, nonverbal, psychological, and physical abuse or humiliation. Now, if you were to look up the legal definitions around bullying and harassment, bullying is not usually specified. However, many different organizations will have bullying come in as a subsection of harassment. There are slight differences, but bullying will generally be dealt with on an organization-to-organization basis, but typically anti-harassment legislation and rules will kind of subsume bullying in them. And the next one that we need to talk about is harassment. So harassment is unwelcome comments or behaviors over time that are known to not be welcome. Serious one-time offenses can also sometimes be considered harassment. So you can see why bullying would kind of fit under harassment, and the Ontario Health and Safety Act specifically deals with and defines harassment in this way. Discrimination. So this one is a bit different. Discrimination is treating someone differently based on stereotypical categories rather than their unique individual characteristics. Examples include race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and more. Like I said, there are 17 specified grounds upon which you cannot discriminate. And this is where there's a difference between the Ontario Health and Safety Act and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. That if you have a person who's bullying you, but not for any specific reason, they're just creating a toxic work environment where they don't like you or something like that, that would fall under bullying and harassment. However, if there is someone who is making fun of you or bullying you because of your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexual orientation, that falls under the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And that's where those two legal frameworks are different, which is why we need to make a difference and define harassment and discrimination differently. Definitions. This is the fun part. So I, like I said, I'm in the Bachelor of Social Work program. We talk about intersectionality all the time, so I was able to have a bit more fun with this one, and I was very privileged to be able to do this presentation. But intersectionality can be a little bit complicated, so I tried to simplify it in this presentation. But essentially, we all occupy different social positions in our life. These different social positions come with advantages and disadvantages. And intersectionality describes the situation where being a part of multiple positions that have disadvantages means that those disadvantages add up to something bigger than they normally would have. So when I say social positions, this can include all of those different kind of discriminatory categories, would be kind of a good way to think about it. But are you white? Are you Black? Are you Indigenous? Do you identify with any of the LGBTQ2S+? Your religion, your ethnicity, even the language you speak. All of these different things have different advantages and disadvantages. Disability is really a simple one. If you're in a wheelchair, your ability to access services depends on how accessible those services are, like wheelchair access ramps, elevators. These different positions have different advantages and disadvantages. And if you belong to multiple categories of disadvantage, instead of just adding up independently, they combine to create a larger disadvantage than you normally would have if you just experienced them separately. For example, a Black man, and this is real statistics that I pulled up, a Black man makes 74 cents and a white woman makes 78 cents for every dollar a white man makes. And that's just on average, just across, I believe it's across Canada. This is not accounting for, specific types of, like, whether, you have a white man who's uneducated or a Black man who's educated, or this is just an average. However, a Black woman makes only 64 cents for every dollar that a white man makes, which is less than both the Black man and the white woman. This is because her position as both Black and female interact with each other. They intersect to create a multi-layered experience where the discrimination she experiences specifically in her wages is greater than simply just being Black or just being woman. It combines and intersects, which is where you get the intersectionality definition. It's where those two things intersect, create something unique and different. So we're also going to go through some different kinds of harassment and discrimination. And when I went through these, I looked at, obviously, if like you shouldn't bully somebody based on some kind, like you shouldn't bully somebody, period. So I didn't put bullying because of their disability, bullying because of their ethnicity, bullying because of their race. Obviously, that just goes without saying. However, I did try to make, to give specific examples of where harassment and discrimination for specific specified grounds and where it's unique. And that's what I tried to do with these definitions. So for example, discrimination on disability can look different. Not making reasonable accommodations for a physical limitation, such as a wheelchair. So if someone is in a wheelchair and it doesn't cost that much money, or there's a reasonable way that you can accommodate a wheelchair, but you don't, then that's discrimination. Nicknames based on perceived disability. So if there is someone who has a disability and then you call them names based on that specific disability. For example, I work with a person who has I work with a person at work who has Tourette's, and their tick, they sometimes sound like a chicken, and it's just how it ends up, or like just how it comes out. And he's aware of it, and he's super cool with it, but there were times where management had to step in because people were calling him a chicken. And that's specifically because of the disability he has. That's discrimination. Paying somebody less because of the perceived notion that they are less capable because of a disability. So, someone who works in an office in a wheelchair, that doesn't actually impede their ability to do the office work, but they might be perceived to be less capable because they have a physical perceived disability. Poverty. So one way that you can discriminate against this or harass somebody is assuming that someone on social assistance or social housing is lazy. One of the things that I've experienced, I've been working in social service jobs my entire life, and especially now that I've got my social work education. Someone who's on social assistance or social housing, rarely is it the case that they are lazy or unmotivated. In fact, I usually find the opposite. People who are on social housing are some of the hardest working people I've ever met or ever heard about, or stories that I've been told. My experience has been the exact opposite. But assuming that someone is lazy because they're in poverty would be a kind of harassment, discrimination. Not giving service to someone based on the state of their clothes or cleanliness. This is also a kind of discrimination and harassment. It also can be a bit more subtle, such as education or lack thereof. So someone who is living in poverty will have less access to education, whereas someone who is living on the higher end of the socioeconomic scale might have more access to education. So if I have, I'm getting my second degree and I've had access to education, and I'm very thankful and privileged for that. But if I assume that, well, that person over there had to drop out of high school so that they could work to make sure that their family was able to eat, and I assume that their opinion is not as valuable because he dropped out of high school, but I'm completing my second degree. I'm better. I'm more important. That's a subtle way that poverty can kind of sneak into our viewpoints, our worldview. Sorry. So assuming that someone isn't assuming that someone isn't valuable because of their lack of education as a result of poverty, it's a kind of subtle way that harassment and discrimination can fit in there. Ethnicity. So ethnicity is interesting because we typically think of ethnicity as very similar to race, and people will sometimes use them interchangeably, but they're not actually the same. Ethnicity is in fact different from race. Race is the literal physical traits, whereas ethnicity is more about your country of origin, language, shared values, culture, etc. For example, both a Black and white person could identify with Ireland, even though both are a different race. So again, we have to separate those two. because ethnicity will be like, so for example, someone who is from Canada, I would say that like my ethnicity is from Holland, even though I was born in Canada. But maybe the language that I speak, the food that I eat, it will be closer to more like the Netherlands rather than Canada. But you know, I'm also just a white guy, the same as all the other white guys. But again, my ethnicity might be different, even though my race might be the same. And again, you get different combinations of this. So ethnicity and how you harass or discriminate somebody based on ethnicity, there are some that are listed there. For example, using stereotypical accents to make fun of the way someone talks. Ethnicity includes language. So what kind of language you speak? Do you speak English? Is English your second language? Do you speak English with an accent? And again, there's different dialects of English. Making fun of somebody or doing your best impression of what it sounds like to be a person from Jamaica or a person from Scotland or a person from India, that can be something that can be discriminatory and harassment. Treating cultural traditions as strange, weird, or wrong from an outside view. Things like arranged marriage, how you structure the family, eye contact. These are all things that are governed by culture and things that in different ethnicities might think of differently or value differently. And so to say, well, you know, this person isn't smiling at me or they're not talking to me, it's like, right, but that might be something in their culture that's normal. And it's not that anyone's being rude, it's just that there's just different ethnicities and different cultures that we need to make space for. And lastly, not recognizing the legitimate differences between different cultures, i.e. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and Thai people may all be from the like Southeast Asian part of the world, but they're not the same. They have different cultures, they have different languages, they have different traditions. They're not the same thing. But how many people have you heard say, Asian people all look the same? That can be harassment and discrimination, giving people the space to be different. Sexual orientation. So sexual slurs and insults. So basically just making fun of somebody because of the sexuality that they have, you know, someone who's part of the LGBTQ, not recognizing their sexuality as legitimate. So I know this can be particularly poignant for the bisexual community, that if you have a person who is bisexual, they just assume, you're not actually bisexual, you're really just heterosexual and you're just trying to get some clout or street cred by being gay when you're not. And again, it gets needlessly complicated. But if someone says their sexuality is a certain way, recognize and validate that that's what they think it is. But not recognizing their sexuality as legitimate can be a form of discrimination. And lastly, assuming that someone with a minority sexuality is deviant or criminal. One thing that's really sad is that homosexuals are sometimes accused of being sexually attracted to children, or they equate the two to say that, oh, if we give homosexual people rights, how long before we give pedophiles rights as well? We're basically saying that homosexuality and pedophilia are the same thing. They are absolutely 100% not. So that's a way that we could discriminate against people with differing or minority sexualities.
And I'll jump in there, Paul, just to let
Sure.
you grab yourself a drink too. I'm sorry to let you go dying for so long, but that was a great explanation there and such great examples and definitions there. So thank you for that. I'd just like to express also, as we were saying before, how ethnicity and race are two separate ideas and two separate things that need to be understood. You have talked about it so amazingly, and you're going to talk about this as well with sexual orientation and gender, as they are not the same things. And that is something that as well that we need to keep in mind in the workplace, while we are legitimizing and validating people's experiences and their their experiences and then their stories as well. So we just want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind as we move forward with your amazing, beautiful explanations that you have done so well and are going to continue to do so well because you've already explained all of these things. This is just a huge encouragement. So I'll let you continue on more.
Cool. Thank you for jumping in. I do appreciate that. Okay, yeah, so Titi just mentioned gender. So again, gender and sexuality are different. Gender is more about the inward experience of how you feel you fit into society along terms of like gendered lines. So we typically think in the binary of masculine and feminine, but those two categories can be much bigger than we typically give them credit for. So gender is not who you are sexually attracted to. It's more about how you feel and who you are inside. The way that you can discriminate or harass somebody based on gender, if there is a person who is trans and you know that they're trans, deliberately misgendering someone who is trans. So if someone identifies as male, but you deliberately call them female, or say she or her, this can be something that you're basically saying that their gender isn't legitimate. That's essentially what we're communicating to them. Second, assuming that a woman is not capable of doing a quote unquote man's job, like computer engineering, auto repair, plumbing. Another common term in there is something called mansplaining, where a man assumes that a woman doesn't know what she's talking about and that the man needs to condescendingly explain to her, even though she is completely capable of knowing about and computer engineering and auto repair and plumbing and so on and so forth. The third one there is assuming that a man is not capable of doing a woman's job, i.e. things like childcare. And you can also make gender-based insults. I know that I've heard this one at work a bunch, but if I'm looking for something in the closet and I can't find it, and then a woman comes and finds it and says, "Oh, you were looking with your man eyes," because men are inherently unable to find things, stuff like that. And the very common and unfortunately ubiquitous insult, "Don't be such a pussy." We literally equate femininity with being scared or being cowardly, which is ridiculous, but it's so common that we don't think about it. That is a discriminatory and harassment, like you can harass people with that phrase. We're saying that women are cowardly and scared, and that the worst thing for a man to be is feminine. It's very like, again, this is you can go a whole lot deeper. I watched an entire documentary on that topic, but it yes, gender-based insults are a form of definitely a form of harassment. Race. So again, we talked about ethnicity before, and we talked about how ethnicity is different from race. But race can be more overt and it can be more subtle. So for example, hate crimes, racial slurs, and racial violence are overt. Most people agree on this, in the sense that, okay, you're deliberately saying that a certain race is inferior and we should get rid of them, we should kill them. Obvious forms of overt racism. The second one is following a black man around a store because he might steal something is more subtle. So you're not saying that he is going to steal something, or you're not saying that you're making an assumption that a black man will probably steal something more than a white man or a white woman or something like that. And that literally changes the way that you behave towards them, and you behave towards that black man in a very subtle way. Well, maybe not so subtle, but it's definitely more subtle than, say, like a hate crime or a racial slur. The last one, and this one I actually found, I found this as an example on a legal website: not giving an immigrant man adequate training because you assume he'll just make a mistake anyways is even more subtle. So that's not something you can necessarily point out or even say, like in your head, you're not thinking, "Oh, I'm racist." But let's say that there's a lot of immigrant turnover in your job, that you work as like at a manufacturing plant, and immigrant turnover is a huge thing, and they're all they're all immigrants from like Northern Africa or something like that, and there's a lot of turnover, so you don't give them adequate training on the job because they're only going to be there for a month and a half. So that would be discriminatory, but you wouldn't necessarily think about that and go, "Oh, I'm being discriminatory against North African immigrants." You wouldn't necessarily think that. So racism can be pretty subtle, and the way that we discriminate against people of different races can be pretty subtle and hard to point out. To give you some food for thought. Religion. So an employer not hiring someone because they are a different religion from themselves. This is actually pretty, this one's kind of pretty straightforward. The employer that I work for, they changed their policy not too long ago, like I think within the past 10 years, but they used to only hire Christians. Like it was Christian Horizons. They used to hire, you needed to go to and get a pastor's recommendation in order to get hired under Christian Horizons. They have since changed this, but I think they had to because that's a discriminatory policy. The second example, an employer not giving as many hours because of religious observances, i.e. prayer, religious garments, prevent certain types of work. This one can get complicated. I remember hearing a case about about health and safety and Sikh people, because the Sikh people wear turbans for their hair. It's like a sacred garment, but because of that, they can't wear hard hats. So they had to make accommodations on a construction site and things like that. But obviously an employer might find that really annoying and say, let's just not hire Sikh people. So you see how that can really kind of shotgun into a really discriminatory and harassing situation. But yeah, basically, there's a lot of places where religion can kind of interfere with employment, and employers might just forego hiring particular types of religions for that thing, or they'll just not give them as many hours, or they just won't. They'll put them on hours that they don't like, stuff like that. This is all different kinds of discriminatory practice. You can also have religious-based insults, where you just insult somebody because of the type of religion that they have. Assuming all people within a religion are the same. You know, not all Christians are the same, not all Muslims are the same, not all Hindus are the same, and with any religion and with any worldview, there's going to be there's parts of it that are great and parts of it that aren't so great. So if you interacting with a Christian and you saw one video of Westboro Baptist Church and now you assume that all Christians are like them, would be doing an injustice to all Christians. So again, not everyone from every religion is the same, so you need to treat them with that kind of respect, that they are going to be their own unique person in their own faith. Okay, so intersectionality can get really complicated. And by the very nature of what intersectionality does get complicated. So I came up with a case study that shows how this can get complicated, but also how it can be useful to look at how discrimination works in the life of a very specific individual. So I talked about and came up with this example of an injured female engineer from Zimbabwe. So this person occupies at least 5 social categories. 1, female. 2, educated. 3, immigrant. 4, an ethnic minority, so her culture is different. And 5, a racial minority. So she's from Zimbabwe, she is Black. And these 5 categories all interact with each other in really interesting ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but they do. So I'll go over it on the next slide, and I'll try to make the complexity of it a bit more simple. But before we do that, let's talk about the research. 44% of foreign trained engineers in Ontario are not working as engineers. This is sometimes called brain waste or the brain drain, where Canadian immigration policy pulls educated immigrants away from their country, but when they get here, their education isn't respected or valued nearly as much as native-born education and experience. So the result is that 44% of foreign trained engineers in Ontario aren't working as engineers. Almost half of them aren't working as engineers. Immigrant men make 15% less income per year of education than their native white counterparts in the same job. Immigrant women make 29% less income per year of education than their native white counterparts in the same job. And immigrants report that healthcare in Canada is economically and culturally less accessible than for their white native counterparts. So these are just kind of some basic stats about what this fictitious Zimbabwean injured female engineer would be going through. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one of these social categories that she occupies and then say how it affects different things and how they all interact with each other. So the first one is female. As we just saw, females are paid 29% less, and they're also less likely to be hired. That we already know that that just being an immigrant means that you're less likely to be hired as an engineer. But I didn't include it on the slide, but females are less likely to get hired for their specific education. I think it was 50% of female foreign trained engineers in Ontario aren't even working at all. Like they're just straight up unemployed. So they're less likely to be employed. But if they are employed, they make 29% less than their male immigrant counterparts, they make 29% less than their native-born counterparts. So they already make less money and they're less likely to be hired. Now, she is educated. She's got a 4-year engineering degree that she got in Zimbabwe. So her income is actually going to be a bit greater than someone who is than someone who is not educated. So that is, she's going to make a little bit more money than a female immigrant from Zimbabwe who is not educated. So she actually does make a little bit more money. But here's the problem: her immigrant status affects her educational status. Because she is an immigrant, her education is not her education is not valued as much. The result is that her income is less. Excuse me. Her immigrant status also affects her ability to access healthcare. So one of the rules regarding immigrants when they first come to Canada is that there is a 3-month kind of waiting period between when they get here and when they get they come under like the Ontario Health Plan or the Canada Health Plan, stuff like that. So they actually have a gap in services that immigrants who get here basically have nothing. And again, immigrant also affects income. So the previous slide that we talked about, the immigrants made between 15 and 29% less income than their native-born counterparts, even when they had the same job and the same experience and the same education. Now, she's also an ethnic minority, so her ability to access employment is less. So again, being an immigrant, we talked about that. Ethnic minority, her ability to access employment is decreased, and also her access to healthcare. There was one study that I found that ethnic minorities didn't feel like they had access to healthcare because none of their local health clinics spoke their language. So in the case of someone from Zimbabwe, doctors aren't going to speak Shona. Their ability to tell a doctor about their specific health concerns, no one speaks Shona. So their ability to access healthcare that helps them is going to be less. And lastly, she's a racial minority. So again, racial minorities are less likely to be employed, and if they are employed, they're going to make less money. Now, this Zimbabwean worker is injured, so she needs healthcare. Now, if she's in that first 3 months, she's not getting healthcare. But you say, okay, well, a conservative person might say, well, she should get a better job. It's like, right, but because of her immigrant status, her ethnic minority status, her female status, and her racial minority status, her ability to get employed is decreased. And then further, you could say, okay, fine, if she doesn't have, she's not employed under a good job that has benefits, she could just say, well, she should pay out of pocket. Well, unfortunately, because of her female status, her immigrant status, ethnic minority, and racial status, her income is decreased, and her ability to pay for healthcare is now decreased as well. Things like optometry, dentistry, prescription medication, all of these things, physiotherapy, acupuncture, all of these things that are usually covered by an employment benefits package are now being paid out of pocket, but her ability to pay out of pocket is decreased as well. All of these different things combine to create a lot of intersections that basically mean that she doesn't have access to healthcare in the same way that a native-born white person who speaks English and is educated would be able to get. And this is what intersectionality looks like. I know I kind of went like word vomit there, but this is what intersectionality looks like, and it can get complicated, and it really does affect real people. Like, as much as I made this person up, there are actual real engineers from other countries that their education is not respected. English is a second language, and they can't communicate their health problems. They're not making as much money. You've got physicists who are Uber drivers, and they can't get any of this access to services. And so, as much as this is very theoretical and abstract, it's also very real. And intersectionality really affects people in very real ways. So I hope that I've done justice to this concept, even though it is pretty complex.
That was amazing, Paul. Thank you. I think if even more expressed is to look at the example and to bring back your friend here, who's this engineer, migrant worker. She's a very real example. We've seen her many, many times before in many different forms, and male, female, whatever it is that she comes in, students, older migrant workers. But she's been here in Canada, in Sudbury before many times. And, she's went to the walk-in clinic, and she's been told it's $60 for her appointment and $20 for the note that she's asked for, and she has to put all that money on before she even gets to see the doctor, before she even gets to move around anywhere else, or she has no choice, that she has to pay that money in hand in person. That is completely debilitating, and incredibly hard to do for that said person, especially when, think of yourself, if for any other person that has that full status, who is able to, have that one extra piece of security in Canada, in Ontario, you're able to go to the walking clinic. You don't have to think about paying for your actual doctor's appointment that day. Maybe you have to pay for the doctor's note. Maybe you don't. Maybe your insurance is going to cover it. Maybe um,
Exactly.
your
Exactly.
your work is going to cover it. You don't have to really worry about these things. This woman now has to worry about, oh, I have to pay $100 for a scratchy throat that I had, and now I can't afford my groceries that I was supposed to feed my kids for the next week or
Right.
month.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it's an incredibly real story. It's incredibly hard thing to see. We've all seen this before, and we know that there needs to be more done. We know that intersectionality works in incredibly wide ways throughout our society, especially here in Ontario and Canada, and we need to do something about it. What can we do within our workplaces? What can we do within our society? What can we do in Sudbury, in Ontario, as a whole, to initiate change, to let Canada know that we better. We need better employment laws. We need better immigration laws. We need better equal pay for equal rights. Today's April 12th, just so happens, which is equal pay day. So that acknowledges the pay gap in between women and women inequality that you so eloquently put earlier today, speaking on gaps between women in Ontario alone. Um, we know that this is something that's incredibly real and that we need to have more change about it. Um, there are different ways that we can get involved and different ways that we can take action right here in Ontario and also right here in Sudbury. So let alone that today is Equal Pay Day and there's an entire coalition going on and many actions that we do to let the provincial leaders know that we need equal pay, we need to close the pay gap between women. But there's also other actions that you can take part in that are a little bit more widespread and to help address some of the intersectional gaps that have been affected by, we're affected by within our system, within our employment rights, within our within our daily lives, and affect each and every one of us as workers. So the first one here is justice for workers. This is decent work for all. So Justice for Workers stands up and fights in the sense that it fights for equal rights for everybody, equal pay for equal work, proper and full protections for everybody. So this includes gig workers, workers who are doing these part-time contract or independent work. For example, if you're working on a phone or you're working on an app like Uber, for say, these are the workers that they're trying to reach out to. They're also trying to reach out to migrant workers. They do a lot of work with migrant rights and status for all. This tries to help out and give out full and permanent immigration status for each person, each worker who comes into Canada and is trying to, have their rights legitimized, have access to the benefits and protections that each and every one of us already have and are so incredibly grateful for, but are still lacking as they may be. We know that although they are great, not having them would be incredibly debilitating. And we see that for our migrant workers who have done so much, who are in large part, a lot of these farm workers, a large part in a lot of these international students through part-time work, large part, a lot of these, workers who have been brought in, and as Paul was saying, devalidated or invalidated about their experiences and about their education and about their historical lessons that they've actually brought with them, and then thrown into expected to take up some other opportunities, some other jobs. But we know that these people are incredibly more capable of so much more, but have been valued and are forced to work these harder, or forced to be overworked and incredibly underpaid with zero protection. So how do we really address these protections? How do we address these issues? My justice for workers and status for all is one of the great ways that we can do that. Fighting for those full and permanent immigration status for all. Taking action to ensure migrant and undocumented people have the same rights and benefits as all other residents. And these are just a few of the ways, a few of the limitations that they hope to overcome in that process for like income supports, things like SWEAC, decent work laws, no deportations and no detentions. These are the things that they have to worry about if they all of a sudden they lose their job and they can't actually fight for their rights and stand up if they are unpaid or and experience harassment and bullying in the workplace. We want to make sure that employers are actually enforcing these rights properly. It stands for each and every person in the workplace, not just migrant rights, but for everybody in the workplace, that they should be taken seriously when they come up with a harassment claim. When they say, I've experienced something in the workplace that needs to be addressed right now. We need to ensure that employers are doing so with a serious attitude that is about change and it is about proactive measures. So that way, moving forward, these issues don't come back and they don't portray themselves again. The best way to make change is that we're reflecting and we're actively doing something in a conscious effort. I will let Paul join in a little bit later too, but another way that we can really start taking action and address these issues in the workplace and to take more action addressing intersectionality is looking at a living wage. These are one of the ways that we can help pull our workers and our and society in general out of poverty, trying to create an essential idea of where this is where everybody should be paid, so that way they're being able to interact properly and efficiently in society. And then this number that has been calculated by the Ontario Living Wage Network has been verified and resourced, so that way it takes into account different measures and different different necessities that we as workers and we as society need to do as to keep ourselves alive, to be able to interact. So things like food, housing, many things like going to the doctors, simply being able to have a little insurance that way you can go and interact and go to the movies. Things like that are simple things that every worker and every person living in society should be able to do with a minimum wage that they're not able to do because their minimum wage is too low and is keeping people in poverty, not allowing them to break that line, not allowing them to get more opportunities for themselves. That's why we see so many migrant workers coming from harder situations or coming to look for a better situation, and then they're forced into poverty when they come into living in Canada because they're forced to take these underpaid jobs that are only giving them minimum wage or less because there's no protections, right? Or so few protections if there are any. This is especially why we need to push the living wage, especially here in Sudbury, where we're a large part of migrant workers and international students. And we need to make sure that we're fighting for their protection and then their longevity. So that way we see proper production in Sudbury as it continues to evolve. So we express the living wage is the hourly wage that a worker needs to make to cover their basic expenses and participate in the community. They understand that while an employer is paying a living wage, their employees can face these fewer stressors. They can actually be kept out of poverty. They can be kept and be able to interact whenever they want to. In Sudbury, the living wage is calculated just below $17, so it's 90. It's like Toronto is closer to $20. I think it's a little bit above actually. But these are all things to keep into account when we're trying to address intersectionality in our workplaces and then address the many multitude of issues that workers may be facing. Simply paying them a proper living wage helps keep them out of poverty, helps to allow them to afford those necessities. So that way, if they have to do such things, or if they so happen to be a migrant worker who has to pay these things out of pocket, they have that little extra bit. So that way they don't need to worry about being forced, having to lose out on groceries for that week or having to forced to make a hard choice as a result of something that was out of their control. So we want to make sure that we're putting these measures in. Same thing with the Poverty, Housing, and Advocacy Committee, where we're advocating for workers and making sure that if they are forced into these positions, that they are giving a platform where they can speak up for themselves and not to be judged. Speak up in a safe space and speak out where they can feel like they have the resources that they can go to. That way they can bring themselves out, whatever that is that they have, that they're experiencing. If they are homeless, if it is whatever it is that they're going through, they need to have these resources available to them or things are never going to get better.
I did have a little thing that I did want to jump in with. Is that the one thing I love about the living wage is how it is kind of an intersectional policy. So OTT talked about it a little bit, where the living wage is calculated for what you would need for basic necessities in that specific community. So what it's going to be in Toronto is not going to be the same as it is in Sudbury. What it costs to live in Sudbury is going to be different than what it costs to live in Toronto. So as a result, I think TT mentioned it was like $20 in Toronto, something like that, or somewhere close to that number. But that's why it's so much better than the minimum wage, because minimum wage, as a random example, let's say minimum wage is $15. That might be perfectly livable in Timmins and completely unlivable in Toronto, because it doesn't account for the cost of things in that particular city and that particular area, that particular community. In Sudbury, we're very aware that, gas, way more expensive than down south, and food, way more expensive than down south. But down south, land or housing or rent might be way higher than it is here. So, minimum wage just doesn't cut it. $15 or whatever it happens to be, it costs a different amount of money in different places. So intersectional thinking would basically say, okay, well, let's account for that. Let's give them a wage that actually accounts for where you live and how expensive things actually are where you live, which is why I think the living wage is such a cool concept to me, and it just makes complete intuitive sense.
That's amazing. Yes, and that essentially wraps up the point very well. Especially the point of especially the intersectionality policy that is pretty much driven behind the living wage, that it needs to take into account individuals or each city and each place to take account what is needed to actually be able to survive in that city, in that area. It doesn't try to take in the whole generalized population of all of Ontario, or rather taking in across from Timmins and trying to apply such dynamic areas. It tries to address the issues that are at hand. So that is our beautiful presentation. Going back to Paul, that is Paul's beautiful presentation for per se. I would say let's give him a nice, beautiful round of applause for that. You're going to be able to access this presentation online, resources, references, so on and so on. And yes, I will cut this part out later off, but
thank you.
Amazing job, Paul.